Hi there. Let's kind of work out some of these ways to kind of work on our bending technique. For cleaner bends, there's really only three things you really have to focus on and worry about. Step number one is kind of knowing which way you're bending the string. So if you notice, when I was doing a lot of these bends, I'm very conscious of what string I'm on and also which way I can or cannot bend. If I'm always going to be doing full step bends, um, or step and a half or two full step bends, I need absolutely the most fretboard that I can get. So on the low strings, the low E, A, and D strings, I always bend down towards the ground. So I'll do something like, and then the other ones theoretically I can go downward, but it eventually it'll die off. And in some cases, it might be actually better to just push the string upward rather than bend it downward, because mechanically of where we are on this on the guitar and what string we're playing on, it just makes more sense. So on the G, B, and high E strings, I tend to bend upward towards my face. So that sounds like this. Right? And that just makes it easier for me. It doesn't really have a lot of fuss going in, trying to figure out which way to bend. It just kind of keep it that way. Of course, on the D and the G string, you could kind of go either down or up. It doesn't really matter as much. But once you get to the fringes, like the low E and the high E, you can't really go up on the low E or down on the high E, because then, right, that happens, and you don't want that to happen. Step number two is fingerings, and kind of figuring out what finger to use and why you're using that finger, or what might work probably better for you. Let me just turn this pedal off real quick. It's making a lot of noise. A lot of the time, you can do single finger bends, so it might sound like this. But the most I can really do on one finger is probably about a step and a half, 3 frets. And so it doesn't really work the best for doing big bends, but it works really good for doing the smaller, maybe half step or even a full step bend using only one finger. Another thing to really note about using one finger is that you only really want to do it, at least from my experience, only when it feels easiest to do and you're not really forcing yourself to do it. So for example, if I'm playing this riff, let's say I'm doing a pentatonic or a minor kind of riff, I'm doing 9/11 on the D and then 8/9/11 on the G. And let's say I want to do a bend here, 8/9 on the G. Right? It's a lot easier to just use that one finger rather than... It just depends on the sound that you want and what you want the outcome to be. But I tend to find that if I use my first finger, the one finger style bend, it's really because I'm doing a half step bend. It just feels fluid, and then I can easily do a hammer on for the next note or whatever. But if I know I'm going to be doing, a half step bend and then a step and a half later, it's much better to use more fingers. That said, you can also do two fingers, middle finger and your first finger. And the way that would work is that mechanically, I would do something like this. I would move my hand over here where my middle finger's on the 8th fret of the G. And then with both of my fingers, I'm either pulling down or pushing up, whichever it might be. And I can do a, whatever style bend. It still feels kind of difficult to do if you're going to do a big bend, though. And so that's where the 3 fingers comes in. And that's usually probably my go-to if I'm ever going to be doing a lot of bending and I know I'm going to do wide, big bends. It's a great idea to just use your ring finger, middle finger, or first finger. And for example, if I was here on the 8th fret of the G, it would look like this, where it's like every finger occupies a fret, but really it's my ring finger that's on the note that I'm going to be bending, right? And the other strings are just there to kind of help and supplement either way. So that would look like this. Right, and then of course you can always practice, bending with vibrato. Something that Eric Clapton, I think, mastered pretty easily, to be honest. He really, and a lot of blues players really have that awesome big wide bending and vibrato kind of thing going on without the use of a tremolo. I'm actually very spoiled, and I use a tremolo a lot in terms of what I do. And it's also, now that I'm on that subject, it's also important to note it doesn't really matter how much the guitar costs. The idea is to get that technique down so that way you can go to any guitar and be able to do this, right? So whether you have a cheap guitar, whether you have an expensive ass guitar like this one, it doesn't even matter. You should be able to do bends no problem. The only thing I would say that's very important is the setup of the instrument, because if you have the strings very high off the fretboard, it does make it more difficult. Or if you have the intonation off, it's like you're never going to really get those bends in tune. And it might feel wrong or it might sound wrong, a whole bunch of other things. And also tuning stability, because if you're doing bends and then the string is getting caught here at the nut, because the string actually moves back and forth, it slides, it might actually get messed up here, or the slots are not correctly cut, or what have you. So it's a good idea to double check everything in terms of setup. And then the very last thing, which is probably, it's actually not as important as the other two, to be honest, but it still applies, is the idea of muting other strings that you're not going to be using. So for example, my left hand, the job of my left hand is, and the fingers of my left hand is, or fretting hand, is to do the bend. That's obviously objective number one, but you don't want it to sound like this. Where you can hear one or two or three other notes kind of happening in the background. And so the idea to kind of keep clean is the same idea you would use if you're doing like the John Frusciante kind of thing, like the... you would practice that kind of idea where you're striking all the strings, but you're only really letting one note ring. And here it sort of applies, but not as much or deeply, I guess. So for example, let's just go to the 7th fret of, let's say, the D string. And we're going to bend that up to the 9th fret. Okay, a full step bend. If we do it, you're hearing a few other notes going on at the same time, and it doesn't really sound clean. So what we kind of need to do is kind of isolate what are the strings that we are kind of hitting and kind of letting ring out. Usually if you're going to be doing something on the D, G, B, or high E strings, it's usually going to be that string and then maybe the other higher strings above it that are going to be giving you a problem. So usually if I'm doing a bend on the high E string, because of how I'm picking and sort of not really trying to mute, but I am muting some of the other strings, it comes out really clean compared to me doing a bend on the D or the A or the G string. Okay, so it's very important to kind of isolate that. So then, if I'm doing on the D string, right, I'm hearing the A string was ringing out a little bit. So with that in mind, I kind of have to also be very aware of where I'm picking at. So I'm going to try with my right hand to always really focus in and pick only that specific string that I really need to let ring out. So I'm not going to be trying to hit every single string, even though I did say this is really good practice, right? Right, striking all the strings. In this case, we don't need to strike all the strings, but in some cases, it might sound cool to rate. Right, so it might sound really cool to be able to do that. but it's not really something you really need to do when you're doing bends, you know. So I'm gonna switch to another pick here since I just found this one. So the idea here is to really just strike only that string and maybe one other string. And the key here is to also kind of try to mute the other strings adjacent to the string that you're going to do the bend on. So for example, if I'm striking the D string, we're going to do a bend on the D string. My job is to kind of passively mute the A string and also the G string using my first finger or my middle finger or whatever, maybe even my thumb, just very lightly kind of touching on there. So I might do something like this. And I can already start to hear that now that I'm using my thumb to kind of mute the A string and the low E string more, it's not as much kind of these other overtones kind of going on. And then my first finger is already kind of lightly touching these other strings, so I'm already passively muting the high strings and the low strings. So that's very important to do if you want cleaner sort of, you know, style bends. Let's move to another string. Let's say the B string. And let's say I'm going to do 10 to 12 on the B. And you can tell it becomes cleaner because now I don't have to worry much about these other lower strings. And even then, I could kind of use the palm of my right hand to kind of just subtly touch, you know, the strings there to mute them, right? So, you know, it kind of kills those strings. And then I'm only really striking the B string, maybe hitting the G string, and maybe hitting the high E. And it sounds like this. Right? And it does sound cleaner. And that's kind of what you also have to do is working, well, if I can't mute with my left hand, I could try to mute with my right hand. So let's do the right hand muting with the D string again. And it is doable, and with practice you can get pretty clean. So just to recap, step number 1 is which way you're bending. Step number 2 is the fingers you're using. And step number 3 is just really trying to work out muting with your left hand or your right hand to kind of kill off the notes that you're not really going to try to hit. The last thing I do want to talk about is that if you are interested in the idea of raking and then doing that one bend, you have to almost mute every other string with something and then just rake the strings and then still be able to do that bend. So it might sound like this. If I do it slow, and what's going on there is I'm actually really secretly only using 2 fingers. I'm really only using my ring finger and middle finger, and my first finger is actually very lightly muting the A and the D string. My thumb is kind of lightly muting the low E string, and then the high E is just already being naturally muted by my ring finger. So it sounds like this. And it sounds really cool, and it's a cool little thing to work on. Or right? It's all just practice, and it's all just kind of working out what works best for you. All right, hopefully it helps. Have a good one.